Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon, and today is episode 5 of our series, A Secular Bible Study. The fifth book of the Bible, the completion of the Torah, the last of the Pentateuch is Deuteronomy. I'm almost sad to see this part of the Bible go. There is so much to look at here. There is such a setting up of the rest of the biblical texts, and really, of course, this is the foundation to the Israelite nation. If you haven't watched my first 4 episodes, I'd encourage you to do so, as what happens here in this book is a summation of many things that have been set up previously. So let's just jump right in today with point 1, which is book overview. Now, Deuteronomy means in Greek second law. If you can believe it, even after everything that has happened in Exodus and Leviticus in terms of law, we get more. We get a redoing, a second contract, or maybe third now, Abraham, Moses again. We get a relisting of the 10 Commandments plus some add-ons. We cover what went wrong with all of the Levitical laws, but we didn't take any away. We're just going to add some more. We're going to give some clarification. We're going to double down. A lot of times I think people like to think of it as Old and New Testament and that they're so congruent, which is already problematic. But this is another restart. We had the Garden of Eden, but that didn't work out. We had the fall, and we had a whole system set up post-fall, but even that didn't work out. So we had the flood, a mass murder of almost every single thing on this planet. But yet man started again. And when we were too good at working with each other and collaborating, and when we had just one language, which would have made understanding God's word so simple, God said, nope, Tower of Babel, let's start this thing over again. Spread you guys out and confuse your languages. That should help with my overall purpose and message. But that led to most of his chosen people being in captivity for 400 or 430 years in Egypt. Oh, and by the way, somewhere in here was a covenant with Abraham, but he sets the people free and they get a new covenant with Moses as they wander around in the wilderness. And now in Deuteronomy, they are getting a second law, a renewal covenant for the children of the generation whose promises didn't come true. How many iterations and times do we have to completely start over here if you are an all-good and all-knowing and all-powerful God? But I digress, not the point. The point of these is to give you a pretty objective view of what is happening in these stories and what we can know about them historically and factually, along, of course, with some of my commentary on the issues presented for the religion that stands today. So, second law, and this book is really broken into 3 parts, and all 3 parts are kind of sermons or monologues from Moses. In the first 10 to 12 verses, we get Moses kind of telling the story. Hey, here's what happened. Here's what God did for us. And he's chastising this newer generation, because remember, the curse that happened in Numbers was that the original Exodus generation would not get to enter the promised land. Well, all those soldiers have somehow miraculously died, every single one of them, even though Moses was older than most of them and he's still kicking. So within this 38-year period, everyone that needed to die died, and now we have this fresh new generation, and Moses is addressing them, the new children of Israel, telling them of the horrible things their parents did and the wrath of God that they brought on themselves, reminding them of all of the blessings and grace of God and all of the wickedness and wrongdoings of Israel. I'm surprised he could say it with a straight face. But during this time, we get some pretty important prayers to the Jewish people, as well as some new promises and an idea that this generation will indeed inherit the promised land. So this is the training section, and we'll cover some of those important prayers like the Shema when we get into the main themes. The second part of the book is that renewal of law and the add-ons, and we get all kinds of add-ons. We get more dietary restrictions, we get more family and business restrictions, but it seems that we're getting a lot more about other gods. Now this, I think, is where things get interesting. We've seen all throughout these first 5 books, you should have no other gods before me, and we see them building a false idol, a graven image, the calf at Sinai. And the way that these words are broken down in Hebrew and these different terms that are thrown about no other gods, no false gods, and no false idols are 3 different things. Now, I don't want to open a can of worms, especially if you're a believer, but there is good reason to believe that the original Yahweh traditions and believers would have seen him as one of a pantheon of gods. Yahweh's origins as El, or the son of El, and his previous marriage to Asherah, and all of this other more ancient traditions of this same storm god Yahweh show him just like all the other gods of mythology that we think of. Battles with his father, fallouts with his wife, proving his potency as a god by the worship he gets from his believers and the victories that he has through them in their conquering of other people that serve other gods. So again, especially in this book, as they get ready, as Moses is training these people that are going into a land, the Canaanite land, with many different gods, it seems he's wanting to show them there is no other God above our God. Not that there's no other God, but hey, we've got the best one. And a lot of ways that Christians have explained this other concept or this other category of other gods is that the other gods are other supernatural beings like fallen angels or demons or devils or the devil himself. And that's fine. I guess we don't need to have this clarification, but it seems to me, and to many who have studied this much more than I, that there's good reason to believe that the concept was there were many gods, and it was about choosing which God you were going to worship and which God was most powerful. And this is backed up in the Old Testament immensely. And then the third part of the book is Moses' final speech and death and handing the reins over to Joshua. We also get, as an interesting point, the longest prayer in the entire Bible comes in the third part here, Deuteronomy 32, I believe. It's known as the Song of Moses, or Moses' poem, or Moses' Song of Witness, and it is about the grace of God even amidst Israel's rebellion. But just a little side note, what I think is really interesting here about this final speech, this is Moses getting everyone geared up before he dies. Like, you're going, you made it, 40 years, here we go, slavery in Egypt, parting the Red Sea, your parents' rebellion, you're going to get it, don't mess it up. Here's the rules, here's the laws. But he says, on the other hand, you're probably going to screw this up. He is so filled with doubt at this point in his life. Imagine, he dies at 120 years old. So he's well over 100 at this point, and he's seen it all. And he is just so fed up with the cycle of rebellion and consequence and screwing it up all over again that he says, listen, you're going to screw it up. Here's the good news. When you do, not if, when you do, anytime you find yourself in captivity or under God's justice, meaning God's wrath, if you turn to him, he will deliver you. Which then, what is the point of the promised land, right? Isn't the whole idea, if you're just zooming out, God has this people, they're his chosen people. It's the covenant of which he's going to bless the entire earth. He's going to use them and set them apart. This is going to be a people group of priests, is what we are told in Exodus and Leviticus, that they are going to be held to such a higher standard of morality via the law in comparison to all of those other tribes and practices around them, that it will be like a nation of priests. They will go through this, what should have been a very small wandering, but turned into this horrendous 40 years because of their disobedience, even though they had this law that would make them so much more moral than everybody else. And even though they haven't gotten better at following that law, Moses is like, yep, 40 years is up. You paid your penalty. It doesn't matter if you learned or not. In fact, you're definitely going to screw this up. Let's go over there and murder everyone, take the promised land anyways, and you're probably going to screw it up so bad that God's going to just take it away from you and give it to your enemies again, which he does, which we see. How bad is God at making all of these plans? But anyways, that's the setup. That's the book overview. That's what we're working with. Let's move on to point 2, which is authorship and date. I don't have anything too new to say about this. Again, see the last 4 videos and see specifically when I cover in Genesis to get the full measure of the difference between the traditional sense that Moses wrote the Torah, which of course is problematic, especially in this book as he describes his own death, or the documentary hypothesis, which mixes really 4 ancient sources together, that the best belief is they were compiled during their exile in Babylon because of one of their times of disobedience. This would have been late 5th or 6th century. And they were putting all of this together as they were preparing for their release, because if they're obedient, they get their act together, God's going to deliver them, which he does. And so this period of compiling their law, their history, all of their oral traditions together, all of their different sources would have been very helpful. Now, specifically, and that's been true for the last 4 books, but specifically for Deuteronomy, we get an idea of an alternate way of getting this book, something else that rises up to significance within the scholarly aspect of the authorship for this. It's a process of redaction, but it ends with a 7th century period of time that is associated with the kingdom of Judah. For instance, in 2 Kings, we learn more about this period where we have King Josiah within the kingdom of Judah implementing significant religious reform, which looks a lot like the second law given in Deuteronomy. And so there's this hypothesis that really this is a retelling or a looking back to get inspiration from for the Israelites now under King Josiah. Could be either or, could be neither. We don't really know. What we do know is it started with a lot of oral tradition. People started to collect this. We had the priests collecting it. We had 2 different views of God, the Yahwehist view and the Elohist view or Elohim view, along with the Deuteronomical sources. We combine all 4 of those together and we get the first 5 books. I'm glad to finally be done explaining this book after book after book. So let's move on to point 3, which is historical context or background and accuracy. So this, like the last few books, is going to be rather short because there's just not that much evidence for this kind of a people group at this kind of scale for this many years in this place of the world. There are some things that we do see accurately. For instance, Moses is reminding his people about these new laws and why it's so important to keep them in contrast to the other tribes around them, the Canaanites, the Moabites, etc. And we know that these were real people groups. In fact, all of these sermons that Moses is giving is done in the plains of Moab. We know this to be a real place. The Moabites, once again, had a portion of land that we know archaeologically speaking. We can see their pottery, we can see their inscriptions, though none of it describes Israel at all, and it's a spot that is east of Canaan, separated by the Jordan River. So there is some historical accuracy here in terms of landscape and people groups. Was there a portion of Jews that crossed through this place at one time? Probably. Is it this story directly? Probably not, but we can't say one way or another for sure. Again, especially this book. Like this happened a little bit in Leviticus with so much being around the camp at Sinai that it's just in this one spot for a very short period of time, and there's just not that much information. But we do get a look into the insight of these people groups, of the other gods that people worshipped, into the tribal nature and hierarchies and rules within those groups, and again, some of the landscape and cities and rivers and landmarks, etc. We really don't get archaeological evidence until the Tel Dan Stili, which we see an inscription of the House of David, which is going to come much later. So what we're working off are these oral traditions put down into collections of books is really the best that we can do. So moving on to point 4, literary analysis. This has been really interesting. And again, we get a unique perspective here. We've had something different in almost every single book so far. And yes, in general, the genre is that of ancient Near Eastern literature. And the narrative forms that have been happening with techniques like chiastic structure, etc., and repetition have definitely been seen across everything. But again, each book gives us a little bit of a unique taste, and this one is going to be treaty. We've seen legal code, we've seen moral code, and even though we've had covenants in some of the previous books, this is our first hard line in the sand example of treaty. And specifically at this time, we'd be referring to 2 words, suzerain and vassal. Suzerain is going to be the owner of the contract, so to speak, the superior party. Vassal is going to be the weaker or the subordinate party. And this is important and it's interesting because this is how God is setting it up via Moses, where all these other tribes are recognizing that their king is some kind of supreme power. Moses is saying, as we have leaders like myself and what's to come with Joshua, etc., they are still under the vassal portion of this. They may be higher than you, but they are not suzerain. They are not the supreme power. That, in our case, for our rules, is always going to be God. We're not going to put that right onto a man or a leader with some divine nature or affinity. We, as his people, will always be the subordinate party, the vassal. Again, this just goes to show the Christian doctrine and ideation of being worthless and lower than at all times as a place of worship for something greater. Again, there could be some beautiful things identified with that, but the way that it's usually referenced and played out, I think, is grotesque. But again, we get this core legal material as we're getting into this re-covenant with God and our understanding for the new generation so that they don't end up like their parents, cursed and put out of the promised land. In fact, Moses goes on to use blessings and curses. That's a big part that I didn't cover during book overview, where he lists out during all the laws and legal code, here's what you can expect when you do well, and here's what you can expect when you do poorly. So again, this treaty nature between the 2 parties. Okay, point 5 is going to be main themes. Now, I think, again, like all these other 4 books, we could pull out so many things from here. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about one of the most important prayers in all of Judaism and even in Christianity, and that is going to be the Shema. And then we'll talk about maybe 1 or 2 other themes. But I don't think we can get any more clear on theme or motif than the Shema itself. So what is Shema? Shema means listen. But listen, this Hebrew word is more so listen and respond. This is found in chapter 6, verses 4 through 9. It is the foundational statement of belief for the Jews. And again, Christianity has really adopted it as well. Let me just read it for you really quick here. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as the frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on your doorpost, on your house, and on your gates. So in a very simple prayer, in a very simple verse here, we see a few things. One is the admittance, the acceptance of God as the one true God, and that we will love. And love is not this lovey-dovey, oh, I feel so close when I'm reading my Bible. This was a love of obedience, a love of action, really by following the commands. This is even seen in the New Testament from Jesus himself. When he describes what it is to love him, it is to obey his commands and to meditate on them, to focus on them. When you rise, when you go to sleep, when you leave, when you come home, write them on the door, teach them to your children. So again, I just can't state how important this is to the faiths in general. And we're getting that from this very specific sermon or prayer from Moses, the Shema. So other main themes, just quickly here, we won't expand on them, would be that of monotheism, as described in the Shema, but we see this elsewhere as well, again, really prepping these people before they go into the land of Canaan, which is funny because they came from Egypt. Like, they're well aware of people that worship these other gods, but I guess this is a new generation. They've been in the desert with their actual God wandering around in a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. I guess it would be quite the culture shock to see that other people believe in sun gods and fertility gods, etc. So monotheism, another would be societal norms or ethics or morality, whatever you want to call it. Again, it's hard for me to say this is a theme when we see, and you'll see this as we get into point 7 here, how grotesque some of the things these people do in the name of God are in this very book. But there are some pretty things, and there are some things that may have been new for the cultures of this time. There was a tithing, and the tithing went for the priest, but another 10% every few years went to the poor among them. This is where we hear that religion is taking care of the poor and the widowed, and Jesus reiterates this in the New Testament as well. And if that's all religion was, wouldn't that be amazing? Just an understanding that we are all blessed as equal people and that we need to take care of the people that have been, through no fault of their own and through circumstance and fate, less fortunate than us. That would be a wonderful world prescription, but it's not that. We will get into that in point 7, which has become a catch-all for not just contradictions, errors, and misconceptions, but the issues within the Bible. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's move into point 6, which is reception and influence. I'm not going to say too much for this point simply because it is nothing that is going to be very unique from what I've said on the last 4 books. Again, with such a focus on law and commandment, these legal codes, these treaties, etc. Like, yes, we've seen that blend into the New Testament and bleed down from there. And Western society at large has taken a lot of these ideas, even the fact that we have the 10 commandments in our courthouses, or some do some of the time, that we would reference this as some kind of a starting point, even though it's inaccurate, it's still what has made it through the traditions. Again, did this happen before the 10 commandments? Absolutely, people knew those things were wrong. Has it happened organically in other societies that weren't tied to this at all, in even more ancient traditions? Yes, it has, but it doesn't negate the influence that has still come from this. In terms of like modern culture and art, some of the things that we could get from Numbers and some of the things that we could get from Genesis are not as easily pulled from books like Leviticus or books like Deuteronomy. This is essentially just a combination of sermons. When it comes to the religions themselves, though, of course, like again, just going back to the example of the Shema, and there's other prayers in here that are almost as important as those that are still said on a daily basis by people who keep the Jewish traditions. This is one of the first proclamations of faith, which we are going to see continue to get changed and adapted all the way up to some of the New Testament creeds that are really spelling out like, okay, what do we believe about these gods? Even the fact that we would have creeds like this, that if you go to a church, you can ask for their creed of belief or whatever term they're going to use, and they're going to say like, here it is. Do we believe in the gifts of the Holy Spirit or not? Is the Trinity biblical? What is our stance on baptism? What do we denote to be the main means of salvation, etc.? They're going to have this kind of listed out. And I think that that is a trickle-down effect from this very first congregants of Moses with the new generation saying, let's get on the same page. So that would be it for point 6. Let's move right into point 7, which, like I said earlier, is a catch-all where we can talk about all the things that go wrong here. I guess the first thing to note would be inconsistent laws, whether it's the laws of or the rules of engagement for warfare. Sometimes they are told to completely annihilate a people group. Sometimes they can leave some people alive, but only certain people. Sometimes they can take certain certain things as plunder, sometimes they cannot. This isn't so much a contradiction because we get a new set of laws before each battle, but it is maybe some misconceptions about who God is or what he thinks is fair. Like there should be some standards in warfare. Again, with inconsistent laws, like back in Exodus, we see one way of handling a rape. In Numbers, we see another way of handling a rape. And in Deuteronomy, we get yet another iteration. We'll get into that when we read some of these horrific verses. But that's Deuteronomy 22, 28 through 29. The death of Moses has some misconceptions, again, around how could he have authored it if he died. But the burial of Moses is where we get some conflicting things. We are told in the text that God himself buried Moses, that no one else could be present or know about the secret burial site. Well, this works very much against the cleanliness laws that God himself established of what he would not allow even around himself, yet alone for the priests to have on themselves when they even came into his presence. So now he's just skipping all of that and he can touch dead bodies himself. Again, God can do anything, of course, that is the core concept here, but this is still contradicting in nature about what offends God and what simply cannot exist in his presence and to his corporeal touch. We're going to see inconsistencies with that everywhere in the Bible, though. It started out in the Old Testament, like I said, you have a God who is very hands-on. Then he gets a little more mystical. Then he comes back, lots of intervening. And I think that would be the next thing to point out here. I'll leave Moses' burial alone, would be just the contradictions within free will. We've seen this all over the first 4 books, but again, especially here with some of these battles, I'm going to read you the verses specifically where you hear again about God hardening the hearts of certain kings so that they have to go to war, just like he did with Pharaoh, not to mention the fact that God is the one winning these victories. It wasn't the skill or the size of the armies. That has never had anything to do. It's had to do with God delivering them over to the Israelites. Over and over and over and over again, we see God literally, not metaphorically, not in some weird context, just hands down showing up, doing things like burying Moses or making a ruler stubborn so that he can justify his genocide. But again, we're going to get to some verses in a second. More contradictions again would be, what is the concept of other gods? We have 7 different verses in Deuteronomy alone that mention other gods, and it is inconsistent and unclear as to how many other ones there are and if they are just false idols or again if they are real deities. We get contradictions on if it's okay to make images, like graven images. We see one thing in chapters 4 and 5 and another in chapter 27. We get a difference of if the earth will last forever in this book. We get differences on how merciful and if God is merciful in general in this book. We get contradictions on what angered God at Moses. Was it the thing at the rock? Was Moses being punished for the people? We see that in chapter 3. Moses is blaming the people, saying God has punished me because of you. We see contradictions left and right in this book about are we punished for the sins of other people? Just inconsistency after inconsistency about every single one of these laws. Is it wrong or right to keep the Sabbath? Is it wrong or right to covet? Can someone see God's face or not? Is it okay to swear? Can God be tempted? Again, I will leave a link for you to a longer list of contradictions like I always do, but it goes on and on. And so to finish here, I want to read a few of the more problematic verses in this book. Okay, so the first one I'll share with you is from chapter 2, just kicking it off right away with genocide, issues with free will, etc. Let's get into it. This is chapter 2, verse 30. But Sihon, king of Heshbon, refused to let us pass through, for the Lord your God has made his spirit stubborn and his heart obstinate in order to give him into your hands, as he has now done. So just God's full-on admittance of completely playing with this guy's will. Please explain to me again how anyone has free will under this God. When Sihon and all his army came out to meet us in battle at Jahaz, the Lord our God delivered him over to us, and we struck him down, together with his sons and his whole army. At that time, we took all his towns and completely destroyed them, men, women, and children. We left no survivors. So a lot of times when people bring up the clear genocide that's in the Bible, people have one of a few excuses. So they worshiped false gods. Sometimes you'll get they committed child sacrifice. Yeah, horrendous for sure. Human sacrifice was a thing back then, like how God asked Abraham to do it, or how God actually let Jephthah go through with it, or how, I don't know, God did it to his own damn son. Seems like God really understands child sacrifice. this. So not a good argument as to why we would have to go kill all these people. And by the way, let's just assume that God is perfect. He doesn't engage in human sacrifice at all, which he clearly does. And that these other groups are really evil, that they're just horrendous people who love killing their babies, which they weren't. Please explain to me the logic of the good people to kill every single person over here. Isn't that just the ultimate child sacrifice? At least it was a very, 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 very small proportion of children in some of the tribes that they conquered that were actually getting sacrificed. Killing all of the children seems worse. You were the Child Protective Services of the day. Child Protective Services doesn't come in when someone is beating their children and beat all of the children in the household to death to solve the problem. Like, the fact that any Christian with a straight face can try to give these kinds of justifications and excuses is ridiculous to me. And if it happened anywhere else by any other God in any other text in any other holy scripture, you would say wrong. Look how bad Islam is. Look at the terroristic nature of this. Look at the sickness. Look at the child sacrifice. Look at the child marriage. Look at the institution of marriage being broken down as there's multiple wives. Look at the unnecessary warfare. Look at the suffering. Look at the sacrifices. Look at the pagan rituals, etc. It's all here in this book. It's as disgusting, if not more. No amount of pretty verses makes up for any of this. End of story. This fits in with the contradictions really well, this next one. So in Deuteronomy 24:16 and also in Deuteronomy 28, we see God saying that, hey, parents should not be put to death for the sins of their children, and children should not be put to death for the sins of their parents. Great. God is overturning in this second law some of the horrendous generational sin and punishment that he established in earlier books. Wait a second. There's some other verses. In Deuteronomy 24:16, God says, parents won't be put to death for the sins of their children, and children won't be put to death for the sins of their parents. But then in chapter 28, verses 30, we get some of this. You will be pledged to be married to a woman, but another will take her and rape her. You will build a house, but you will not live in it. You will plant a vineyard, but you will not even begin to enjoy its fruit. Your ox will be slaughtered before your eyes, but you will eat none of it. Your donkey will be forcibly taken from you and will not be returned. Your sheep will be given to your enemies, and no one will rescue them. Your sons and daughters will be given away to another nation, and you will wear out your eyes watching for them day after day, powerless to lift a hand. This is a curse from God to a man for disobedience, where he will let you get engaged just to take that precious virgin and have other men rape her. That he will allow you to have animals and houses, but they will all be destroyed or taken from you. And that you can even have children, but you will watch as other tribes take them as you are powerless to help them. And by the way, what do we know about the tribes back then and why they were taking children, including the Israelite tribe? Slavery, and usually sexual slavery. So God is absolutely punishing wives and children for the sins of this man. So not only is it a contradiction, it's absolutely disgusting. I encourage you to read through all of the curses that God is more than happy to bestow for the most inoffensive of crimes, by the way. I also have to read to you from Deuteronomy 22:28 through 29, like I mentioned earlier. If a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married and rapes her, and they are discovered, he shall pay her father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the young woman, for he has violated her. He can never divorce her as long as he lives. So not only is this a contradiction into what we've seen with how men must be dealt with for the punishment of rape where they are to be killed, now God is saying you don't kill him, you make him pay the father and marry her, and he can't divorce her. I wonder how that's going to go for her. Let's think about this poor woman, because some of you are so twisted on trying to make this not horrific that it is, and will say things like, yeah, well, rape happens, it's unfortunate, but look at God trying to bring unity, making the father whole for what he's lost, because the father was going to sell her in marriage and now he can't because she's deflowered, which means she's worthless, so the father still gets his money, and no one would marry her now that she's been raped. So if we force the rapist to marry her, she still gets a husband who will provide for her, and God will make sure he can never leave her. I'm sure he's going to treat this woman really well. I'm sure that he's not going to continue to just rape her every day of her life now that she's his bought and paid for property and she can't leave him. She has no say in this. This is disgusting. This is not good. Full stop. I don't understand the objections to this stuff. I think I'll stop there it goes on. There's more examples. There's more sickness here. That's why it was hard for me to even talk about societal norms and ethics and morality as main themes, because this is disgusting. Has there always been slavery? Yup. Has there always been murder? And have people always abused children because of their vulnerability? Absolutely. But to put it in writing, to make it a punishment, to flat out not only condone, but endorse actual genocide based off race and ethnicity is what we say is the most horrendous thing that has happened in human history. We look at Hitler, we use Hitler as the example because of his extermination of a people group, specifically because they were of that people group. And he was simply taking one small page from God's playbook. Now, what Hitler did was horrendous. I am not demeaning it or making it small, but what God did was worse. These books prove it. So that's where we'll end today. We're done with the Torah. In one point, I'm sad to be done because there's so much interesting history and religious setup here, but on the other hand, not that it's going to get any better. Joshua and Judges is pretty disgusting, so buckle up. But at least we're starting to leave some of it behind. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something. Share any other facts you have about this particular book or any questions or objections you have to anything that I said. I'll try to reply to as many as possible. Have a wonderful day. Thanks again. And until next time, keep thinking.